If you're a fan of my channel, you know that I theorize that A Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire may not just be a fantasy story. It may be a post-apocalyptic sci-fi story. Telepathy, telekinesis, and technology may be able to explain all the astounding events. And the story of the Others and the Long Night might actually be a story of genetically altered humans and nuclear winter. Now, by holding this belief, I get a lot of messages from people, and it's actually amazing how many people came to the same conclusion that I did. But there are, of course, skeptics, and skepticism is good. The big four skeptical arguments I get are, number 1, you're nuts, tinfoil. Only a completely insane person would come up with that theory. The second argument is, George R. R. Martin confirmed it isn't sci-fi. The third argument is taking something rather astounding in the story and failing to find a sci-fi explanation for it. The big one that I get over and over again is about the shadow babies. And finally, there's the more philosophical argument, what does it matter? Sci-fi is fantasy. First, let's go over the idea that I'm nuts and only a crazy person would come up with this. Well, as it turns out, George R. R. Martin fully admitted that when he was coming up with the story for A Song of Ice and Fire, he considered the idea of hidden sci-fi. Now, I'm going to show a clip of George R. R. Martin in an interview with IGN. It's a bit out of context, but don't worry, I'll show the rest of the clip later. The point of it is just to show that George R. R. Martin was thinking about these issues. The question still remains whether he executed these ideas.
It always would have been an alternate world, a secondary universe, as Tolkien called them, with not France and the Netherlands and Spain, but Westeros and Dorne and Essos and Bravos and so on. It was always going to be that. The question was, should the fantasy elements be overt, or should they be almost science fiction elements in disguise? And that was the other thing I was playing with, that there would be people who commanded what would seem to be magical fire powers, but maybe they were just pyromancy, psionic ability to create blasts of fire with your mind.
So George R. R. Martin fully admits he was thinking about the idea of hidden sci-fi. So no, it's not a crazy idea at all. Of course, the question remains of whether or not he executed it. On a side note, it's kind of funny that George R. R. Martin accidentally uses a fantasy term when talking about a sci-fi element.
Magical fire powers, but maybe they were just pyromancy.
Pyromancy is magical firepower. He meant to say pyrokinesis. It's an understandable slip of tongue, but we'll get more into this when we talk about question number 4. Now, many people say that George R. R. Martin has said that the story isn't sci-fi, and some even use the word confirmed. Many point to this July 12, 2011 interview with Entertainment Weekly. This may be a silly question, but when you think of the world you've created, where seasons last for years, where is it? It's what Tolkien wrote was the secondary world. It's not another planet, it's Earth, but it's not our Earth. If you wanted to do a science fiction approach, you could call it an alternate world, but that sounds too science fictional. Tolkien really pioneered that with Middle-earth. He put in some vague things about tying it to our past, but that doesn't really hold up. I have people constantly writing me with science fiction theories about the seasons. It's a double star system with a black dwarf, and that would explain, it's fantasy, man, it's magic. So a lot of people point me to that last line, it's fantasy, man, it's magic. Of course, they're completely ignoring the previous line, if you want to do a science fiction approach, you could call it an alternate world. So while calling his story fantasy, he fully admits that it could be called science fiction. This again really points us to question 4. I'd also like to point out that that last line, it's fantasy man, it's magic, is kind of disingenuous. That man in there makes it sound like everybody's overthinking it. But George R. R. Martin has a slew of other stories that deal with weird planetary orbits. There's the Plague Star, and Bitter Blooms, and Dying of the Light. Not to mention the weird orbital planet of Ymir makes an appearance in A Beast for Norn, and the Stone City. And he really constantly gets messages about sci-fi theories about the seasons? I mean, I literally get thousands of messages every week from people. Maybe I'm just neglected, but I've never gotten a sci-fi theory about the seasons. I saw one posted on crack.com once, but that's it. He constantly has people writing him about this? Now I want to show you something about people overthinking things.
These are not quite accurate for my dragons. These are not my dragons, because my dragons only have 2 legs. They don't have front legs. Other dragons by fantasy writers have 4 legs and wings. I just have 2 legs and wings.
Why? Why?
Because it's more scientifically accurate. There's no animal on Earth that has 4 legs plus wings. Nobody has that sort of thing. So even though it's fantasy, I tried too much of a science fiction guy. I want to make it accurate here.
So planetary orbits is too much science fiction, but the number of legs on a dragon is not. Now when people tell me that Ice and Fire isn't sci-fi, they also point to this post on his blog. Is the known world, planet Westeros, part of the same universe as these short stories, novels like Dying of the Light and Greywater Watch? Asimov and Heinlein, late in life, both seem to feel the urge to merge all of their books and stories into one huge continuity. So far, I do not feel the urge. No, Westeros is not one of the Thousand Worlds. Now, many people point to me that last line, Westeros is not one of the Thousand Worlds, as proof that Ice and Fire is not sci-fi. Ignoring the fact that Westeros is not a planet, it's a continent, it's important to note that the Thousand Worlds universe is not the only sci-fi universe that George R. R. Martin writes about. Not being in the Thousand Worlds universe has no effect on whether or not Ice and Fire is sci-fi. It would affect the origin of the Thetas in Game of Thrones, and the question of whether or not the Children of the Forest are Harangans, but that's it. The more important lines are the earlier ones. George R. R. Martin names 2 sci-fi authors who merged all of their work into one continuity. He has not felt the urge, but it does seem that it's possible. Of course, merging the Ice and Fire and Thousand Worlds universes would only be possible if they operated on the same rules. And this again points us to question number 4. Now finally, when people like to say that George R. R. Martin confirmed it's not sci-fi, they point back to that IGN interview. Now this clip has a little more context in it, but make sure to note that it's not George R. R. Martin claiming that the story is full fantasy, it's the interviewer. And note how long it takes George to reply.
Do you think if you hadn't gotten that note, would you have gone full fantasy? Would you have gone full magic with A Song of Ice and Fire?
I might have come to the same conclusion anyway, but Phyllis Eisenstein, who's the writer I was referring to, did put her arguments pretty forcefully. I mean, it always would have been an alternate world, a secondary universe, as Tolkien called them, with not France and the Netherlands and Spain, but Westeros and Dorne and Essos and Bravos and so on. It was always going to be that. The question was, should the fantasy elements be overt, or should they be almost science fiction elements in disguise? And that was the other thing I was playing with, that there would be people who commanded what would seem to be magical fire powers, but maybe they were just pyromancy, psionic ability to create blasts of fire with your mind. But I went with the literal dragons instead of the figurative dragons, because dragons are cool and expensive to do on film, mind you, but worth it and cool.
So he claims that he had a decision to make. Should the fantasy elements be overt, or should they be science fiction elements in disguise? I went with the literal dragon instead of the figurative dragon. Now this answer is a bit odd. He could have said I went with literal magic instead of figurative magic. That would have sufficiently answered the question, but he said a literal dragon. Is a literal dragon magical? Because I seem to remember this.
These are not quite accurate for my dragons. These are not my dragons, because my dragons only have 2 legs. They don't have front legs. Other dragons by fantasy writers have 4 legs and wings. I just have 2 legs and wings.
Why?
Because it's more scientifically accurate. There's no animal on Earth that has 4 legs plus wings. Nobody has that sort of thing. So even though it's fantasy, I tried too much of a science fiction guy. I want to make it accurate here.
So at least in part, George R. R. Martin thinks about dragons scientifically. And in our story, we find out Valyrians genetically engineered fireworms to become dragons. And dragons do appear in a George R. R. Martin sci-fi story called Second Helpings. I fail to see how including a literal dragon solves the issue. And those are all the sources that I know about where George R. R. Martin supposedly confirmed it's not sci-fi. As you can see, there's actually more conflation of fantasy with sci-fi than confirmation that it's not sci-fi. So what about question 3? What about all those things in the story that seem really, really magical? Now, most things in our story can be explained with telepathy, telekinesis, or technology. And yes, I get that that's kind of cheating since those things are really, really broad. But I think it's helpful in understanding the story. If there is no magical prophecy, only telepathy, that means there are puppet masters in the story. If dead bodies aren't actually resurrected, they're being telekinetically puppeted, that means there are puppet masters in the story. But we'll get back to this issue when we answer question 4. Right now, I'd like to answer the most inexplicable thing in our story, the Shadow Babies. In Dream Songs, George R. R. Martin said, "My favorite science fiction film of all time is not 2001: A Space Odyssey, or Alien, or Star Wars, or Blade Runner, or, The Matrix, but rather Forbidden Planet." And he's not lying.
But this is my library here.
Wow.
You know Forbidden Planet, Robbie the Robot?
What's his name? Robbie?
Robbie, he's one of the great robots in
I
history.
can't believe it. I want to have a picture. Can I touch it?
Certainly.
Robbie the robot.
Robbie the Robot.
Oh God.
Good morning, gentlemen.
He's talking. I'm speechless.
You'll find the household silver in the dining room and my daughter's jewelry on our
He knows all the
kidding
dialogue
me?
from the movie. He's got the
The
entire
whole
thing down.
dialogue. Are
Yeah.
you kidding me?
about instrumentality.
Yeah, turn him off here.
I bring up Forbidden Planet because it's the exact same situation as Stannis and the invisible monster that kills Renly. While a man sleeps, his subconscious mind creates a telekinetic monster that kills people. While Stannis slept and couldn't be woken, an invisible monster killed Renly, and Stannis had memories of it. It's the exact same plot of George R. Martin's favorite sci-fi movie. Which brings us to our fourth question. Is sci-fi fantasy? Well, as it turns out, George R. Martin will never confirm that A Song of Ice and Fire is not sci-fi, because he believes sci-fi and fantasy are one and the same. We make up all of the definitions of science fiction and fantasy and horror we want. We can draw our boundaries and make our labels, but in the end, it's still the same old story, the one about the human heart in conflict with itself. The rest, my friends, is furniture. The house of fantasy is built of stone and wood and furnished in high medieval. The house of science fiction is built of duralloy and plastic and furnished in faux future. The furniture rule, I call it. Forget the definitions. Furniture rules. Now next, George R. Martin mentions Phyllis Eisenstein, who is the woman that convinced him to put dragons in A Song of Ice and Fire. Ask Phyllis Eisenstein, who has written a series of fine stories about a minstrel named Alaric, traveling through a medieval realm she never names. But if you corner her at a con, she may whisper the name of this far kingdom. Germany. The only fantastic element in the Alaric stories is teleportation, a psi ability generally classed as a trope of science fiction. But Alaric carries a lute and sleeps in castles, and around him are lords with swords, so 99 readers out of every 100, and most publishers as well, see the scries as fantasy. The furniture rules. So the very woman that convinced George R. R. Martin to put dragons into his story has a hidden sci-fi fantasy tale. Ask Walter John Williams. In Metropolitan and City on Fire, he gives us a secondary world as fully imagined as Tolkien's Middle-earth. A world powered entirely by magic, which Walter calls plasm. But because the world is a single huge decaying city, rife with corrupt politics and racial tensions, and the plasm is piped and metered by the Plasm Authority, and the sorcerers live in high-rises instead of castles, critics and reviewers and readers alike keep calling the books science fiction. The furniture rules. So if science fiction and fantasy are just the same thing, what's the point of this whole discussion? I believe the main thing is scope and how one perceives the story. Although George R. R. Martin may think sci-fi and fantasy are the same, a viewer sees them as different. An audience expects a little more consistency and a few more explanations with sci-fi, while with fantasy people tend to just shrug and say it's magic. If one thinks Ice and Fire is sci-fi, one is expecting an explanation for the long night. Perhaps a comet affected the orbit. Perhaps it's a nuclear winter. With fantasy, someone just says it's magic and moves on. The story changes when one starts thinking about it in a sci-fi scope. Why are people having prophetic dreams? How can dead bodies walk? Why is the moon important for glass candle communication? Are there actually gods in the world? Everything changes through that sci-fi lens. Even if one still doesn't think Ice and Fire is sci-fi, it's hard to deny that George R. R. Martin approaches the fantasy world with a sci-fi eye. After all, he doesn't think sci-fi and fantasy are different, and thinks he could actually merge his worlds if he wanted to. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about George R. R. Martin's sci-fi mind, please check out The Thousand Worlds. You will never look at A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones the same way again. Thanks for watching.